Okay, the French Yellow Vest protest movement enters its eighth week. We've had 7 weekends of protests and riots across France and even spreading as far as Belgium and Brussels. What started out as a protest against a planned diesel tax rise by the Macron government has turned into a much wider protest movement with dissatisfaction amongst the working classes with workers' rights. Small business owners have also joined in with their workers because they're overregulated and their entrepreneurialism is strangled by excessive regulation. Living standards, that's come up. Uh, Price rises. If you plan to tax and raise the price of fuel, that is going to have a knock-on effect in a variety of industries and a variety of employers because their costs then go up. So haulage firms, delivery firms, um, supply chain firms that supply bigger companies with components when they move and make these components out of plastic or metals, there has to be fuel in there to help make and mill the components. Growing stuff, agricultural diesel, that will go up. And rural France would have been very negatively affected by these proposed fuel tax rises. They're also unhappy with the political establishment. There's issues relating to a whole variety of things, and it's not just living standards and wage stagnation. It's further than that. There's also an unrest to do with immigration policy, centralised EU policy. There's a large unrest with many to do with some of the EU centralised policies, and that's not just a French issue; that's a European-wide issue. There is rise of anti or sceptical parties that are sceptical about the EU. The Five Star Movement in Italy is a prime example, and UKIP here in the Brexit argument we've had here in the UK, prime examples of large proportions of the populations of major EU players not being happy with direction that the group of 28 nations is taking. But 2 months of sometimes very violent clashes between protesters and the police. Deaths. There have been deaths as well. France has not seen unrest like this since 1968 with the student protests. Every year in France, there seems to be some kind of strike or protest that does turn violent at some point. It's almost a yearly occurrence in France, but never has a protest movement gone on this long. And shut down the economy. Basically, the French economy has been really hammered by this protest movement. The cost of the damages is starting to run into the tens of millions, if not hundreds of millions of euros. French police tactics have been questioned, especially when they surrendered the Champs-Élysées and the Arc de Triomphe on, I think, the second weekend of protests or the third weekend of protests. Now, while the protest movement in the last few weeks has been smaller, that's down to the Christmas period. Christmas has been and gone. The security forces are quite concerned about the fireworks displayed this evening, so there's a lot more tightened security. But it's not just in Paris that these protests are happening. They're happening across France in major towns and cities, because there is a belief that this reform package that Macron was going to do, which is now starting to unravel very rapidly, would only favour the elite, the metropolitan elites of Paris and some of the big cities, and not benefit those of rural France and regional France. And they're right, it wouldn't. Economically, that diesel price hike would have been economically damaging. The infrastructure is not in place in the rural and smaller towns and cities in France that it is in Paris. The Paris metro is one of the best run metros in the world. It's one of the most extensive metro systems in the world. It's got one of the highest riderships in the world. It's a well-used, well-funded metro system. You could say the same about Toulouse. Even Saint Etienne has a metro system now. The problem is not every major French city has a tram or metro or suburban rail system of the funding that Paris gets or Marseille. That not every French city has that. Toulouse does have one, but not not all of them. And there are some parts of regional France that just have the one train station in a major city, or maybe two major train stations for a city of, let's say, 300,000 people. That wouldn't happen here in the UK. Some towns and cities have multiple train stations. There is an issue with British infrastructure being just old, but the questions keep coming up about infrastructure and the fact that it's Paris centralised, and that's another issue why these protests began. The fact they've been going on now for 2 months, and there seems to be, and the protest organisers have said we're going to carry on into 2019. This could lead to two things: the fall of not only Macron's prime minister and his government, but also the presidential government. Macron could have a vote of no confidence in his presidency. We could see politically, legally, things like that happening, where a presidential election is called early, or a parliamentary election is called early when there's a collapse of the prime minister's government. The French governmental system is really strange. You have the president, who has a lot of power, and a prime minister domestically, who also has a lot of power. And the Chamber of Deputies, there may be an early election, be it for presidential or governmental. That's how one thing. It could get more violent, and there could be a violent calls for removal of Macron and his ministers. The French have a history of removing leaders from power by revolutionary means. It hasn't happened since World War II, obviously, since 1945. There hasn't been that there has been levels of unrest, yes, but there's never been that level of unrest where an elected or hereditary leader of a government has been overthrown. It happened regularly from the late 1790s through to the 1840s, 1870s even. There is a history in France of heads of state being toppled by the Parisian mob. This is more than the Parisian mob. This is a much wider issue. They're protesting now on living standards, cost of living, slow wage growth. Small businesses are starting to protest as well. They're joining in. They're actually physically harming themselves to make a point, saying we are overregulated, we are strangled to death, we are being overregulated to the point where we can't be flexible in how we recruit. We have to abide by all these regulations, most of which don't actually apply to our industry or our business, but we have to, by law, we have to learn about them. It wastes a lot of paperwork. It makes it harder for us to run the business, so the small entrepreneurial shop owners are struggling. Major manufacturers are having issues with labour costs. There's a whole host of issues. The Macron government is trying to force through this reform programme. But there we go. That's my view on it. 8 weeks and counting. They're not giving up. Thank you very much for watching. Please like and subscribe. Place your comments below. I'll have some more videos for you soon.